KPVIDEONEWS, and this story here is like kind of touched me a little bit because it's something that goes back, man. It goes all the way back. This is like 100 years ago, man. So 100 years ago, and so this grant just happened a couple yesterday. Said Minnesota grants state's first posthumous pardon to black man in 1920 case that led to lynchings. The Minnesota Board of Pardons on Friday granted the state's first posthumous pardon to a man convicted over a white woman's false rape claim that led to lynchings a century ago. The pardon comes 3 days before the 100th anniversary of the Duluth lynchings, a dark stain in Minnesota's history. The board took up the 1920 case of Max Mason, who was in Duluth that year with the traveling circus. He was one of several black men accused of raping a 19-year-old white woman in the city. The three men, Isaac McGee, Elmer Jackson, and Elias Clayton, were lynched as a result. After the murders, Mason was the only one convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, the doctor who examined the accuser never found evidence of rape. Mason was denied parole 6 times between 1922 and 1925, according to the pardon application. He was released from prison in 1925 on a condition that he not return to Minnesota for the next 16 years. A district attorney several years later questioned the evidence against Mason and said he likely would not have been convicted if he were white. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who was on the Board of Pardons, tweeted Thursday that justice delayed is justice denied, but 100 years later, justice can still be done. Ellison, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and Minnesota Chief Justice Lori Gilday all voted to pardon Mason. Walz said there was a direct line between Mason's case and the murder of George Floyd. This is 100 years overdue, Walz said. By not addressing it continued the systematic racism. Walz said Mason's case was scheduled to be heard by the Pardons Board over 6 months ago, not knowing that we would see the murder of George Floyd in the meantime. I don't believe anything happens by chance, Walz said. I believe we were given this opportunity. Among those who spoke in support of the pardon was Mike Tuskin, the grandnephew of Irene Tuskin, the woman who made the rape claim. Mike Tuskin is now the chief of police in Duluth. Wow. Tuskin said he wasn't aware of his aunt's involvement until his mother told him about it in 2000, a few years after his aunt's death. Tuskin said he believed the secrecy was because of his family's shame and desire to forget about the injustice. Tuskin said his aunt died in a nursing home after suffering a stroke, incapable of speech and unable to atone for her actions. Tuskin called the case against Mason an abomination and a disgrace to the police profession. He said Mason was arrested based wholly on speculation, conjecture, and intimidation, and out of desperation to make an arrest to hold anyone accountable regardless of the facts and evidence in the case. Justice was denied to Mr. Mason during his lifetime, but this board has an opportunity to right this wrong today, Tuskin said. And Tuskin is the grandnephew? Yeah, the grandnephew of Irene Tuskin, the woman who was supposedly had lied and brought up the charges. So it's like, wow, man, this kind of stuff, this kind of stuff right here. Telling you. It's a crazy situation. Crazy situation. So here we have a black doctor that issues an urgent warning to make healthcare decisions before protesting. And leading educator and recognized expert in advanced planning, Dr. Gloria Anderson urges a major push in preparing advanced healthcare documents for black Americans, especially now during the protests happening simultaneously during a deadly pandemic. The black population in the United States has been hardest hit with fatalities due to COVID-19. Now the protests and riots ain't no riots going on all over the country in protest of George Floyd by 4 Minnesota police officers, young and old alike, are exposing themselves in incredibly large numbers, and in addition to risks of COVID-19, an often invisible killer. Dr. Anderson offers 21 things black community needs to know to get their advanced care decisions in order before the need arises. In her book, African American Spiritual and Ethical Guide to End of Life Care, most threatening emergencies are unplanned, and she stresses the urgency for African Americans to seriously consider advanced care planning to avoid unwanted medical treatment without advocacy for their own wishes, family division, and infighting that happens too often in many families when someone becomes hospitalized or dies without their wishes having been made known to their loved ones or medical profession. In recent COVID ethics update webinar for the Center for Practical Bioethics, Dr. Anderson stated, "We want to see people having those conversations as it relates to people, getting people to talk about end-of-life care plans and emergency health care planning." She says the role of advanced care planning has always been important to not only African Americans but to every ethnic group, but especially for people of color who have experienced grave disparities, not only in healthcare but underlying institutional constructed systems of racism throughout history. Black communities are historically the most vulnerable, and black Americans are much less likely when compared to whites to utilize the end-of-life options, such as hospice and palliative care that can offer support and helpful resources for many families never know are available to them. According to the report by NPR on CDC data, about 1 in 3 who become sick enough to require hospitalization due to COVID-19 were black. Statistically, black people experience more negative healthcare disparities that impact their quality of life at the end of life. Approximately 54 to 59% wind up in hospital emergency rooms and often die in ICU without making their wishes known and without having someone to advocate for or speak on their behalf. With the imminent threat of COVID-19 disproportionately hitting black lives, Dr. Anderson stresses the critically for a black community to make tough decisions now to avoid added duress upon their loved ones in the event of an emergent need for medical care and attention during protests or afterwards, if having to fight for survival from the COVID-19. So it's one of those situations, man. People have to do what they got to do. They got to do what they have to do, man, and just go ahead and get your affairs in order. Get your affairs in order, and get your affairs in order and do what you must. Wow, it's a lot of stuff going on here. A whole lot of things going on. And it's a entrepreneur that launches new social network for black people worldwide to discuss these issues. You know, it's like a lot of issues of racism that are going on in the world, and you know, we as a people, we don't discuss. A lot of times we don't discuss the things that we need to discuss, and just talking with a friend earlier, and she basically brought it to my attention of a situation that happened. Situation that happened that could have basically been avoided, as far as people just having, just letting their anger and their frustrations get the best of them to the point of verbally attacking someone. And it makes no sense. If you look at that person, and it's people out there that have some menial jobs. Let's face it, they have some jobs that don't really pay that much money, and they're putting their lives on the line, especially now when they're working during the middle of a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and for you to come into that person's place of business where they work at, and to give them a hard time, and to basically, maybe cuss at them or call them a name or whatever, and sometimes this stuff, man, it's totally unnecessary. And at this time, we as a people need to really be trying to trying to get together like this and try to be a little bit closer, not a little bit, a whole lot closer than what we have. Because let's face it, it's going to be a whole bunch of people out there that have been subservient, and that's been passed down through their ancestry. That's going to always protect the house. But the people that were dealing with the situation whose ancestors were like from the field, it's like it's a whole, you understand what I'm saying? It's just like it's a whole big different dynamic going on here. So if you want to treat another person bad, that if you was to stand side by side with that person and you look in the mirror, that person could probably be your sister or your brother. Why are you giving that person a hard time? It makes absolutely positively no sense. So let's get it together and move forward. It's time to move forward and get away from the stupidity. Get away from the stupidity. Get away from the from the crap, man, and get away from basically handing ourselves a bill of goods, because it's later than you think. It truly is later than you think. And it's time to have some peace. It's time for some peace and some growth here. KPVIDEONEWS.